Hello and welcome to the Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Fonsa Greenborough, and in today's podcast I'll be looking over the game against Leicester City by bringing you my match review, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Roy Hodgson, Joe Ward and Patrick Vanano after the game. So let's begin. In an even affair which saw two of the league's informed sides go head to head, Crystal Palace fell 2 goals cruel against Leicester City to see their recent success over the Foxes come to a halt. Their first loss to Leicester in 6 meetings, Palace enjoyed infrequent chances of their own, but the visitors were the only team to capitalise on their openings, and goals from Söyüncü and Jamie Vardy were enough to divide the sides at full time. Leicester met visitors South London this weekend on the back of a record-breaking 9-0 victory, but it was the hosts who pushed hardest in the game's opening exchanges. The Foxes' Harvey Barnes landed the first shot on target as the returning Vicente Gaeta early collected his dipping effort, but it was Palace who surged forward with the greatest consistency, Wilfried Zaha and Jeffrey Slutt blinking up well along the left wing to supply those in red and blue filling the penalty area. Jason McArthur was the first to be crowded out by black shirts before Jordan Ayew found himself similarly frustrated moments later, and after screwing an effort over the crossbar, Ayew made himself well acquainted with the visiting back line. After 15 minutes, however, the game had levelled out. Following a defence-splitting pass from James Maddison, Jamie Vardy burst his way to the near post, where Gaeta stood strong to deny the resulting close-range effort. Barely a minute later, Maddison again almost succeeded as provider, when his lofted corner found a leaping Johnny Evans, the ball then headed inches too high to find the net. Ultimately, Evans' warning to the Palace rearguard failed to materialise for the remainder of the first half, and it was the Eagles who posted the most threatening alert when Slutt caught a dropping ball in his chest and launched a deflected effort at goal. With the ball swinging down from Yuri Tielemans' chest towards the net, Kasper Schmeichel had no choice but to tip the shot to safety and back towards the Homesdale faithful. At half-time then, the two sides fairly remained stuck in a deadlock. Looking to increase the tempo of the game's second half, Palace cautioned the visitors as Cheku Kouyaté whipped in a fine cross towards the 6-yard box, but lunging forward, Ayew was unable to turn the ball home and Leicester were let off with a sigh of relief. After Gaeta denied the persistent aerial threat of Evans with lightning-quick reactions, Söyüncü punished the host for leaving him unmarked in the box on the resulting corner. With a bundled header, the Turkey international set the Palace net rippling and undid Gaeta's fine work just seconds before. Palace sought to respond, and one section of Selhurst's main stand clearly felt they had, when Slutt fired a goal-bound ball only to be denied by a narrow deflection off the wall of Leicester bodies. In the same attack, Joe Ward fired into the gloves of Schmeichel. After the vexation of conceding in an even clash, Palace appeared motivated and knocking loudly on the host's door. But their efforts were in vain come full-time after Vardy stroked home a first-time effort into the back of the net on the end of a smartly played ball by Demarai Gray. As if to pin the Eagles back for the afternoon's final few minutes, Ben Chilwell then chipped the inside of Gaeta's post, but his effort bounced into Palace's possession. A third Leicester goal would have been harsh on Palace and, after a game which saw few chances for either side, the final whistle would sound with no further action. So I'm now going to move on to my player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on both Twitter and Facebook at Crystal Palace for all the latest Palace news. So if you are someone like myself who does like to follow a vast array of Palace accounts on both Twitter and Facebook, then of course do head over to the respective sites and follow our pages there at Crystal Palace. Now obviously alongside the latest Palace news, so keeping you up to date with things about the academy, injury news, ongoing developments, all sort of your general stuff there, we obviously do keep it up to date with the latest transfer news as well. So obviously we're not in January yet, but in the run up to then there's going to be loads of rumours, loads of speculation, going to be quotes from agents, stories going around about players coming in and out. So if you are someone who wants to keep up to date with all the transfer news, in particular, during January, during the summer, obviously where, as soon as we find an article, we'll put it out there. Of course, follow us on our pages there to obviously get involved. Alongside that, we also post interviews as well, so whether that's with players, with management, but also, once again, linking back to transfers, particularly in summer, there was a few interviews with agents, so, If there is something we think you'll find interesting, we obviously put it out on the account as well. And then, like I've said already, you know, as just sort of your general club news as well, we also post it on there. So if you do want a place to get all the news, whether that be transfer news, sort of interviews, or just your general news, of course give our accounts a follow. And obviously if you want another account to follow just to get an opinion, whether that be of the game, whether that be of sort of the lineup, whether that be of sort of the injury news, things like that, of course also follow us on there. Obviously before the game we obviously give our reaction to the team news, to injury news, and of course after the game give an instant match reaction. So there's a few of us running the page, so if you are someone who wants just another account to follow just to get, you know, all the latest news, of course feel free to do so there. Now a great place for you guys to share your opinion is in the YouTube comments. So if you are listening to the podcast on YouTube, then do feel free to drop a comment below the video with your player ratings, where you rate the players' performances from 1 to 10, with 10 being the best. Now I say this every week, but you know, the reason I want you guys to do this is just so that you guys can share your opinion with me. I can read through how you rated the players and basically compare how you rated them to how I rated them, and just see sort of where we are and sort of have a discussion, I suppose, based upon that. So if you are someone who wants to get involved, just feel free to comment below with your player ratings, just so we can sort of compare each other's ratings, see how we thought each of the individual players performed, and of course if there are things we disagree with, of course we can have a discussion around that. Now even if you don't want to do that, or obviously if you're a Leicester City fan, obviously just comment below with your general views of the game. Obviously from a Palace perspective, you know, Leicester are a really good team this season, and bar that silly mistake we made by not marking the centre-back for the goal, the first goal that Leicester scored, other than that I think it was a fairly evenly contested match, albeit Leicester obviously had the slight edge. But you know, from a Palace perspective, you know, it's not bad losing to a team like Leicester because they're having a great season. And likewise, Leicester's perspective, you know, they've had a great start to the season and they're just carrying on. They've got that momentum and they're carrying on. So realistically, nothing to be ashamed about, losing to a very respectable Leicester City side, and we're still in a top 10, so I suppose you've got to look at it like that. Now if you do want to follow any of the social media pages that I've mentioned or join our Facebook group, then do check all the links that will be in the description below. But I'm now going to move on to the player ratings, starting goal with Söyüncü, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now in terms of Guaita's performance, I think you can't really talk too much about the goals, just in the fact that, you know, you're looking at the first one and he made a good save from Jonny Evans, and obviously from the resulting corner there was absolutely no one marking the centre back, so obviously that first goal, not really much can be said about him there. And obviously the second one, yes, you could put a little bit more blame on him. He should have maybe done a bit more to obviously stop Jamie Vardy from scoring in terms of getting his positioning right. But actually, aside from the goals, and I can't really put the blame on him there, I think he had a fairly consistent game. Nothing spectacular, but did make a few quite crucial saves and catches, and you know, just brought that influence and brought that sort of calmness back to the back line, which even though Hennessy hasn't played bad, just we seem to be missing ever so slightly in the last few games where obviously Hennessy was playing. But in terms of really early on, obviously Jamie Vardy had a great chance to obviously go forth, and actually Guaita showed that presence, showed that confidence that he brings to the back four, came out really well, took the ball out of Jamie Vardy's feet, and obviously was able to collect the ball from the edge of his sort of 18-yard box. So that just goes to show that obviously that even though Hennessy isn't a bad goalkeeper, just that sheer confidence that Guaita brings just shows back in chances like that, whereas maybe Hennessy might stay back on his line, whereas Guaita is determined, chased Vardy down, got the ball out of his feet, and that was a really good chance stopped, you know, from a Leicester perspective. That would have been a great chance for Jamie Vardy, but obviously Guaita stood strong, which of course was great to see. Now obviously there was one time obviously where he did get caught out, and that was obviously there was one free kick, came into the box, and obviously he couldn't quite get there. But like I said, other than that, I think that he had a very decent outing, and in particular, you know, that's a save in particular from Jonny Evans I thought was quite spectacular as well. So I do think on reflection, yes, obviously we conceded 2 goals, but they're not really his fault. And you know, aside from that little sort of free kick where he obviously misjudged it, you know, aside from that, I think he had a fairly decent game. You know, that good thing in terms of chasing down Vardy, and obviously that even better save from Jonny Evans. I think overall that I think is a fair reflection of the 6 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to the first player in our defence, and that is the right back Joe Ward, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now in terms of Ward's performance, you know, there isn't really too much to talk about, just because he done what he had to do, done his shift for the team, and actually this is something we've seen quite a lot this season. Obviously we've been talking at the beginning, you know, obviously because we didn't sign a right back, would Joe Ward step up to the plate? And whilst his first few games were a bit shaky, you know, certainly the last sort of 3 or 4 games, he started to sort of show what he can bring to the team. And this was another performance where nothing spectacular, but done his job, and actually done a fairly decent job of it. Now, obviously, we know how attacking Leicester are and how good they are and free-flowing in attack they are this season. So, of course, Harvey Barnes was one player that we obviously had to contain, and that was sort of mainly down to Joe Ward. And I think for the most part, throughout most of the afternoon, I think Joe Ward done a fairly decent job in terms of concentrating on Barnes, keeping him quiet, and, you know, limiting his chances. And when you consider, you know, their goal came from a set piece, obviously from the corner, and obviously the second one came from Jamie Vardy cutting inside and having a shot from the edge of the area, you can't really put any blame defensively on Joe Ward for the game, because you know, the goals didn't come from him, and also, you know, you've got to look at it and go, for the most part, he defended well as well. Now, one thing I've talked about recently, and particularly last few weeks or so, is how he's actually been going a little bit more advanced. He's been playing slightly further up the pitch. And this was another game here where he actually looked quite promising going forward, because whenever we had possession, obviously, you know, your usual Zaha and Ayew and Slup would obviously run and chase the ball, and maybe people like MacArthur in midfield and Kiate would drive forward. But actually, quite often, Joe Ward was actually running up and down that right flank, looking promising going forward. And yes, there may not have been anything spectacular in terms of crosses or passes, but it's nice to see him actually getting that high up the pitch in the first place, and just being in promising attacking positions as well, because he's got that defending nailed on at the moment. He can now actually be more adventurous going forward, and we're starting to see that more in his game, which is, of course, for me, a really good thing. So I do think, on reflection, on the whole, I do think the 6 I've given him is a fair result. In terms of James Tompkins, obviously the first centre-back in the team, I'm going to give him a 7 overall. And, you know, much like Joe Ward, much the same in the fact that it was a solid performance, done what he had to do. But the reason I've given him a 7 is that, you know, there were 2 tackles in particular from Jamie Vardy. You know, we know how quick Vardy is, and we know how, not quick, how slow Tompkins can be. So, obviously that was a bit of a mismatch, but on 2 occasions, you know, Tompkins managed to get back, make superb tackles to stop Jamie Vardy going through on goal, and for that reason I've given him a 7 overall, because I probably could have given him a 6 if it weren't for these 2 heroic tackles, because actually, on the most part, nothing spectacular besides them, but he'd done his job, he'd done what he had to do for the team. Yes, he still may not look 100%, still might not look quite confident, you know, in terms of coming back from injury, but you know, the fact that he's putting in good performances here, where he's doing the basics right and he's slowly getting back into it, is obviously good to see. And obviously, as I'm recording this podcast a few days later than I normally would do, obviously there's been a few pictures coming out of the training ground, obviously that Sakho's back in training, and that's obviously big news for us, because of course we've had injuries to Kelly and Dan, and you know, we've had a few injuries there, and obviously Sakho's coming back now. Now, I don't think Sakho will go straight back into the team, but certainly, you know, we know how good Sakho and Cahill can be, but also Kelly as well coming back to full fitness. So, you know, there's going to be, once again, a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about actually who will be at centre-back. And I don't think Tompkins necessarily has done anything wrong in this game here to be dropped next game. But with people like Sakho and people like Kelly coming back from injury, it was obviously going to be a consideration, given the fact that Tompkins, even though he had a good performance, you know, still doesn't look 100%. But I still think, on the whole, he does deserve the 7 I've given him. So now I'm going to move on to his centre-back partner, and that is Gary Cahill. Now, this one may come as a surprise, given the fact that I've given him 7 and 8s all season, and, you know, some people may think this is a little bit low, but I'm going to give him a 5 overall. And I just think that, compared to what we've seen from Cahill this season, and that's why I've given him a 5, because in comparison to the high standards he set this season, this was really sort of the opposite of what we normally see. So we normally see a very experienced, a very sort of quality performance from him, a very calming presence he is to the back line, but we didn't quite see that in this game here. You know, he wasn't as disciplined or as composed in terms of what he done on the ball, and in terms of how he commanded and how he defended as a whole. It wasn't as good as it has been recently. And you know, you've got to look back at the opening goal in particular and go, you know, Gary Cahill should have been that guy marking him. I think Van Aanholt as well was in the box in and around the area. So you're looking at that first goal in particular, and that is terrible, terrible defending. You know, there was literally no one around him. It wasn't just the fact of someone was marking him and they didn't jump. It was literally, there was no one in at least a metre around the centre-back when he went through to score. And, you know, when you make a really glaring error like that, it's obviously going to, or maybe affect your performance, but it's obviously going to affect your rating as well. And that's why, you know, for Gary Cahill, you know, he's been so good this season, but eventually you're going to have like 10 good games, and then eventually you're going to have one slip up. Hopefully this was the slip up here, but you know, compared to his usual high standards in terms of just being that rock at the back, being disciplined, being composed, that was obviously what was missing out of the game. Now, what I would say is that obviously towards, I think it was in the second half, he did get quite a big clash to the heads, obviously drew a little bit of blood. Now, the fact that he recovered well after that, managed to continue playing on, obviously that heroic sort of thing that you normally see centre-backs do, the fact that he was able to continue in the game, obviously you've got to give him credit there, but I just think on the whole, given his high standards he set this season, and just that glaring error he obviously made, amongst other people as well, you know, inside the box, you know, all players shouldn't have been leaving him unmarked, but you know, Cahill, one of the culprits, should be the commander at the back. Obviously, like I've said, I do think the 5 is a fair reflection for that glaring error, but aside from that, a fairly decent defensive performance, and like I've said, that determination just to carry on after that clash of heads obviously shows that just the love for the game, I suppose, that Cahill's got, the fact that he can just carry on playing, do his all for the team, regardless of any injuries he has. So now I'm going to move on to the final player in our back four, a nice patch of Van Aanholt, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, much like Joe Ward's performance on the other side of the pitch, where it was a very good balanced performance between defensive work and offensive work, we can more or less say the same here for Patrick Van Aanholt, and that's why I've given him a 6 overall. But the thing for me that stood out more than anything was just the work rate that he showed throughout the game, and that was in terms of, yes, he was in sometimes in defensive positions, yes, he was in offensive positions, but that work rate to actually get in between the two positions and balance it really well throughout the game is obviously something which really did impress me. Now, there was one particular moment in the game which really stood out for me, and that really embodies his performance, and that was obviously Jose Perez came from the other side of the pitch, obviously had a chance on goal, and obviously Van Aanholt was the guy there to actually get down the pitch and actually defend against him. So, you know, that chance really epitomises for me, you know, just that work rate he showed in the game. When you've got someone coming from the opposite side of the pitch, you've been able there to obviously stop their chance and goal. And you know, yes, Perez did have quite a lot of joy down that flank, you know, throughout the rest of the game, but that one particular chance, I think Van Aanholt done a really decent job in terms of coming back. And when you consider Perez, I think he's already scored 2 hat-tricks this season. He's obviously in great form for Leicester, as are Leicester as a team, but obviously the fact that Perez didn't score in the game and Van Aanholt done a fairly decent job, albeit he did get a little bit more joy out of him than maybe he should have. You know, I think on the most part, Van Aanholt done a fairly decent job down that left-hand side. But like I've said, I've given him the 6 because he got that balance between defensive work and offensive work right, and that was all down to his work rate, working hard for the team to actually run a lot of distance up and down that left-hand side. And like I've said, you know, yes, maybe he could have done a little bit better on a few occasions up against Perez, but you know, that one chance in particular was really what stands out for me. So I do think on reflection, the 6 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the first player in our midfield, and that is Cheikhou Kouyaté, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, much like all of Kouyaté's performances, you know, this was sort of the standard, work hard for the team, lots of tenacity, lots of physicality, and that's exactly what we saw throughout the game. Now, obviously, I always talk about him using his physicality to carry the ball, and that's exactly what we saw here, because we know how good Leicester can be, so it was really important that we played well in the midfield area, and that's what Cheikhou Kouyaté did. You know, he was very good at actually picking up the ball from deep, driving forward, trying to sort of penetrate really the Leicester midfield, try and actually get in behind them and at least try and create chances, because not only have they been good offensively this season, but they've been very, very solid defensively, especially with their Turkish centre-back, whose name I can't remember. But you know, the fact that you had someone like Kouyaté in the midfield, obviously doing his defensive works, but being very, very good at actually carrying the ball, and not just carrying it forward using physicality, but also doing it at pace and allowing us to at least try and counter the pace that Leicester have on the attack. That was obviously really, really good to see as well. And obviously that's all good, him driving forward, but in order to do that, in order to get the possession, he obviously had to be very disciplined in terms of taking the opportunities to actually intercept the ball as well. So not only was he actually, when he was in possession, doing really good things in terms of carrying it forward, but actually he was very disciplined in terms of winning the ball back and then transitioning to getting the ball forward. So the fact that he'd done his defensive work really well in terms of, you know, winning tackles, getting the possession back and intercepting the ball, that was all good, but also he combined that and made use of that extra possession we gained by obviously allowing us to go slightly further up the pitch. And you know, it was a bit unlucky that towards the end of the game we got an injury. You know, I don't really know if it's too serious, and I'm sure we'll know sort of towards the end of the week what's happening there, because of course he's a main player for us, so we don't want to see him be out for too long. But you know, He went off, and yes, he may not have had as much influence as he normally would do in terms of being that real sort of anchor in the midfield and that real sort of driver. But like I've said, he's against the quality of the opposition. You know, we can't really underestimate Leicester. They are having a fantastic season. So the fact that we've done as well as we did in the midfield against them is down to people like Kiarte putting pressure on the ball, winning back possession, and then carrying the ball forward at pace. So I do think overall, on reflection, the 6 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the second player in our midfield, and that is the captain, Luka Milivojevic, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now, in terms of his performance here, it was sort of the bog standard, back to old Luka, where it was a sort of a hard grit, determined performance, doing what he had to do in the midfield, getting involved. And whilst there was not anything spectacular throughout his game, I must say that, particularly in the first half, so first sort of 10, 20, even 30 minutes you could say, he looked determined. He was one of the players in the Palace team who actually looked up for it. And, you know, when you consider we went in at 0-0 at half-time, and, you know, yes, Leicester may have had the slight edge there, eventually going on to win the game, but Milivojevic was one of these players who seemed from the off willing to really up for the game, looking to ping balls forward, looking to get involved defensively, and that really sort of shone in his performance. Now, obviously, as usual, because he's getting involved, because he's being very physical, he obviously picked up a few fouls, but, you know, sometimes you've got to take one for the team, particularly against, you know, a team of Leicester's quality. Sometimes the only way to stop them is to make a challenge, which of course Milivojevic did. But, you know, like the rest of the midfield, given how good Leicester have been in midfield this season, particularly with people like Barnes, with Maddison, the fact that we've done as well up against them, you know, is down to people like Milivojevic, like Kiarte, obviously getting involved and really doing this sort of the nitty-gritty stuff. And, you know, I think as the rest of the midfield as a whole sort of performed really well, but obviously Luka in particular, you know, is admirable at looking at his performance, thinking, you know, that's Luka back to his best, which of course was good to see. Now, obviously the one player he was sort of mainly tasked with dealing with was, of course, James Maddison, and actually for most of the 90 minutes, you know, Maddison was kept out of the game. Yes, he may have had, you know, a few chances here and there, but considering we've seen the damage that Maddison's done in recent weeks in terms of pinging balls left, right and centre, getting other players involved, the fact that he didn't have as many chances and he was kept out of the game for quite a lot of the 90 minutes is obviously down to Luka, obviously doing that hard work, doing the nitty gritty, and obviously making life difficult for not only Maddison but the Leicester midfield as a whole. So I think overall it was a real sort of captain's performance, real nitty gritty, and certainly deserving of the 7 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in our midfield, and that is James McArthur, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, in terms of his sort of positioning in the game, I suppose it's worth mentioning that obviously normally he sort of drifts between a defensive role and an offensive role, whereas actually in this game, in terms of contesting against Leicester, he started a little bit higher up on the pitch, and actually that was all down to us actually trying to beat Leicester in terms of their press, their sort of attacking play and style they go with at the minute. So obviously James McArthur's role was to play slightly further forward, almost sort of number 10 role. I wouldn't quite say that, but, you know, in that sort of area up the pitch, and that was all down to him actually, I suppose, Palace as a whole team, but in particular McArthur actually trying to look to beat the press, or press the Leicester back line, try and actually beat their attacking play, and then try and sort of maybe find weaknesses or try and exploit them round the back. And that was all down to someone like McArthur playing a little bit more further forward, even though he normally plays a drifting role quite central to the field. This one he was definitely quite obviously told to play slightly further up the pitch, and actually I think it was a performance where he showed his usual quality. He's done what he normally does in terms of covering a lot of ground, but obviously you've got to look at when he was moved to the wing. Obviously we know that he's not actually as effective out wide as he is down the middle, so obviously when he's up against someone like Ben Chilwell, he's obviously going to struggle, and we did see that in the game here, because when he started slightly higher up the pitch, started obviously in that central role, we obviously looked to press, and he was doing alright in that role, and we saw his usual qualities there. And even when he was moved out wide, we still continued to see his hard work, his tracking back, him covering a lot of ground, him making tackles here, there and everywhere. But obviously when he was moved out wide up against Ben Chilwell, he seemed to struggle there, and that's obviously because Ben Chilwell's had a great season. He's obviously really great in terms of defenders in the Premier League. He's certainly up there this season in terms of just his consistency and, you know, how well he's playing. But obviously McArthur on his day can be good, but obviously up against the quality there, he did obviously struggle when playing out wide. So I think on the whole, whether he was playing down the middle or out wide, I think on the most part I do think the 6 overall is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the first player in our front three, and that is Jeffrey Schlupp, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, in terms of obviously Jeffrey Schlupp's positioning throughout the game, much like James McArthur in terms of changing positions from central to out wide, obviously in the absence of Andros Townsend, Jeffrey Schlupp was primarily employed as obviously a left winger, obviously to make up for the absence of Townsend. But actually, looking at the game as a whole, why I've given him a 6 is actually when he was moved a little bit more centre, he actually looked a lot more comfortable, a lot more at home, actually playing still on the left hand side, but actually part of the midfield three on the left, as opposed to being part of the front three on the left. Now, obviously, we know certainly at the end of last season how good and how effective he was from central midfield. So, of course, it was understandable that, you know, when going back to a position where he's played so well over the last year, you can understand him playing better. But obviously, primarily, you know, in the absence of someone like Andros Townsend, you need him to step up and play left wing, but instead he was obviously playing in central midfield. Still done a shift and still done his part to obviously help us contain Leicester in the midfield, but nevertheless, you know, he obviously was a lot better in the middle than he was out wide. And I suppose for me that was the thing that was most impressive, and we know this anyway because of his pace and because of his energy, just that dynamism he brought to the midfield in terms of that physicality, that pace, that height, and obviously the skill as well. So the fact that he was combining that in the midfield performance, utilising really them attributes to obviously allow us to get the better of Leicester in the midfield for some parts of the game was really quite good to see. And I suppose, much like Chiarte, he actually really impressed me with his ball carrying ability. So the amount of times where we obviously regained possession, we tried to get up the field, and there was people like Schlupp and Chiarte who would pick up the ball from deep and drive forwards. And that's something in particular from Schlupp that I was impressed with in this game. Now, obviously, with him playing on the left, he obviously, when he was playing out wide on the left, he obviously linked up with people like Vanano, and obviously when he was playing on the left of the midfield, obviously meant that he was linking up a lot more so with Wilfried Zaha, and certainly the interchange and the passing and the little bits of movements between Zaha and Schlupp down that left hand side was obviously quite effective. Yes, nothing really came to fruition in terms of clear cut chances for either player, but you know, the fact that they had that intent and the fact that they were working so well down that left hand side, considering obviously Jeffrey Schlupp primarily was meant to play on the left out wide, but instead plays central out wide, and obviously McArthur played on the right wing, which meant Zaha went on the left. Obviously that just allowed that Schlupp and Zaha partnership to flourish again, and certainly I do think, you know, on reflection, they obviously done a really good shift together. So I think overall, on the whole, you know, whether he was playing on the wide left or in the central left, I think Jeffrey Schlupp had a fairly decent performance, fully deserving of the 6 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to our other winger in our front three, and that is Wilfried Zaha, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now, in terms of Zaha's performance, obviously this is another game that's gone by where he hasn't got a goal or an assist, but much like the last few weeks or so, his performances have been getting better and better, and his influence on the game has been getting greater and greater, even though he hasn't actually had anything to show for it. And you know, this game was a prime example where, against the quality of the opposition that we know Leicester are, you know, we know how well people like Chilwell are defending the flanks, and we know how good their centre backs are. So of course Zaha was always going to have a hard day up against them. So I've given him a 7 because I think it's the way he was able to get above that and actually still look lively was the thing that really did impress me. Now, obviously in the first half in particular, I think that's when he was at his liveliest, and that was just down to, you know, obviously both teams didn't have too many chances in the early exchange of the game, but obviously Zaha was there to use his creativity, use his pace to get the better off of them, and obviously sort of reminding the opposition, you know, the last sort of 3 games we played against Leicester, Zaha has played a crucial role, so he was just sort of reminding them of the threat that he's got. And whilst they defended a lot better against him this weekend as opposed to weekends gone by, you know, the fact that he still posed a threat to them and still sort of was trying everything he could to get past them and was trying new things, trying to obviously use his pace to get the better of them, you know, that was all good to see, and good to see that attacking intent sort of coming back into his game. And I suppose, you know, it really shows how good he's playing is in the fact that actually the opposition just had to relentlessly just resort to fouling him, clipping him, and just stopping him in his tracks. And that just really goes to highlight how well he was playing in this game, albeit nothing to show for it, but just that intent he had and that pressure he was putting the backline under by having these lively moments, having these bits of skill, using his pace. That has obviously led to him being too good for the opposition, that obviously they had to resort to sort of clipping him. Nothing bad, nothing, you know, really violent about it. It's just the fact that he obviously was a bit of a handful for them to deal with. But then on reflection, you know, on the most part they defended well against him, but obviously on another day one or two chances or one or two mistakes in the back line, and them few lively moments could have cost Leicester. So I think on the whole, I do think, given Zaha's performances and how they've improved recently, I do think the 7 overall is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the final player, and that is the striker Jordan Ayew, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, in terms of Ayew's performance, it was a very sort of standard Ayew performance in the fact that he worked hard, used his pace and used his energy to obviously do all of that work up top. And much like McArthur in terms of putting pressure on that back line of Leicester, just playing so high up the pitch, trying to sort of put pressure on them and basically beat their press. I think he's done a fairly decent job of doing that. But the reason he's sort of limited to a 6 is the fact that, yes, he showed strength, yes, he showed quality to obviously battle on the ball and try and win things back. And, particularly when Leicester were playing quite high up the pitch, particularly sort of halfway line area, the fact that Ayew was there to obviously use that strength, use that energy to try and get the better of them and try and control them and try and put the pressure on them to make them cause mistakes is what I liked about his performance. But realistically, I've given him a 6, but there isn't really too much more to say about his performance. No moments of no real chances he had in the game or created chances for others in the field. And just overall, he done a shift for the team. But given the quality of the opposition, given the fact that there were limited chances for both teams throughout the game, and the fact that the ones we did have didn't really fall to Ayew, is why I think he does deserve the 6 I've given him. So I'm now going to move briefly on to the substitutions Palace made in the game. Max Meyer came on for Kouyaté, James McCarthy came on for McArthur, and Christian Benteke came on for Ayew. Now, in terms of all of them, I'm going to give them all 5s because the time they were on the pitch, they didn't necessarily have the greatest of impacts, but they just came on, to bring on the fresh legs and just to help us see the game out. Albeit we still lost the game, but just to help us get to the end of the game, with people like Kouyaté and McArthur having slight injuries, picking them up, it was good to bring people on in their place. So in terms of Max Meyer, yes, obviously people have been calling for him to actually be involved in the team for ages. He finally gets to come off the bench, and obviously he only had a little bit of time, so you can understand him not quite having the influence or the impact you would have liked. But given the fact that people have been calling for him to start, and then when he does get a chance off the bench, he doesn't quite show the quality we've seen from him recently. It was obviously a little bit disappointing. But that said, he had a few nice touches, obviously before he got fouled, and Leicester started towards the end of the game enjoying more and more possession. So when Max Meyer came on, sort of instant impact, albeit nothing created off the back of it, but having nice touches, looking to get involved, which is good to see from a substitution. But of course, after that, got fouled, and then sort of beyond that, he sort of got fewer and fewer touches, and of course Leicester started to enjoy more of the possession. Obviously, James McCarthy came on to replace McArthur. Like I've said, not really enough time to make an impact on the game, and just really was there to allow McArthur to go off for his injury and just to sort of help us see out the game there. And of course, in terms of Christian Benteke, given his height, you'd expect him to be good in the air, but he was particularly good off the bench in terms of when the ball was in the box or when the ball was coming up to him. He was really good at winning the ball in the air, but actually, much like the others, didn't have too much time to make an impact, didn't really have the opportunity to do so. But then likewise, we didn't have too many chances as well to provide him. So I think on the whole, the 3 substitutions we made in the game, I do think the 5s are a fair result. And just sort of talking about the game briefly, obviously, I'm ill at the minute, don't really starting to lose my voice. I'm not going to spend too long on this. But in terms of the result, Leicester are a quality team, and a 2-0 loss against someone who's 3rd in the league isn't really an embarrassment. If anything, it's a really good result for us, if you sort of disregard our recent games against Leicester, because we put in a good showing, but at the end of the day, the best team won. Yes, we probably should have done better with that first goal by actually having someone mark the defender inside the box from the corner, but then likewise, we should have taken our own chances. So on reflection, a very fair result, in terms of we played well, but Leicester were by far the better team. And, in terms of players doing what they had to do, I don't think there was any bad performances in the team. It's just the fact that we didn't quite match up to, obviously, the quality, the pace, and just obviously the technical sort of ability that Leicester have currently got. So I suppose, for me, a really, really fair result, and, you can't argue with that. And certainly, I wish Leicester well for the rest of the season, because it's nice to see someone else up there. But for us now, we've got to concentrate, regroup, get back together. We've got 2 more big games coming up, obviously against Chelsea and Liverpool, and then obviously we've got a nice easier run. I say easier because obviously we've played the typical top 6 teams plus Leicester recently, so we've got so-called easy games coming after that. So of course, Chelsea game at the weekend, really big game, but of course maybe Chelsea will be fatigued from that 4-4 draw in midweek in the Champions League, maybe, but I doubt it because they've got loads of young talent who of course are not going to be tired from that. And of course after that, Liverpool, a really, really big game. But of course, if we can do what other teams have done against against Liverpool recently, look at Aston Villa at the weekend, then all we have to do is restrict them, and we can at least get something from the next 2 games or so. So once again, fair result against Leicester, and bring on Chelsea at the weekend. So I'm now going to move on to my Man of the Match award. But before I do that and give you my Man of the Match and who I thought the biggest influence in the game, I'm now going to give you the 4 nominations I put forward for the award. Now, when you consider it was a disappointing performance in terms of the end result, in terms of losing 2-0, and in particular the first goal where it was very sloppy defending, the fact that no one was marking the defender. Aside from that, I think it was a fairly good performance in terms of containing Leicester and trying to sort of counteract the sort of good work and the good attacking play that they've been doing this season to so many teams. So in that respect, in terms of the first half as well, we've done an alright job in terms of containing them and trying to sort of counteract the good work that Leicester were doing. But of course, in the end, the better team won. Leicester had that slight edge on us, but still, I think as a collective, I think we've got to give the team a little bit of credit because, Leicester are high flyers this season. So the fact that we played as well as we did, aside from obviously the goals we conceded, is obviously credit to the team as a whole. But the 4 players I've picked out for me is the fair reflection of our performances across the field, not just one particular area, because I think, our defensive work, our attacking work, the work in midfield, all parts of our game were good, but obviously not quite good enough to get across the mark, obviously to beat Leicester. So the 4 players I've gone with is James Tompkins, Patrick Van Aanholt, Luka Milivojevic and Wilfried Zaha. So in terms of James Tompkins, obviously I could have picked someone like Joe Ward as well, just because of how solid they were defensively. But in terms of Tompkins, last few weeks or so, just come back from injury, hasn't necessarily been 100%, whereas in this game here, he was a lot better than he has been previously. A very solid performance from him, and for the 2 incredible tackles he made on Jamie Vardy alone, he deserves to be in the shortlist, because Jamie Vardy clean through on goal and Tompkins made himself big and just combined his good defensive performance with 2 fantastic moments there to obviously keep us in the game. Obviously, Patrick Van Aanholt, just that work rate he showed in terms of getting up and down that left-hand side, the fact that he just showed the energy to do his defensive work, but also to run forward and chase balls forward and link up with other players there, as well as when he was in advanced positions doing the opposite and actually running back to obviously chase down Leicester players as well, was of course great to see. And the chance in particular which stands out for me was the one against Jose Perez. The fact that he was so far forward and then had to go back and defend and managed to catch Perez from coming from the other side of the pitch was of course great to see. So just that sheer work rate he had both defensively and offensively is why I put Van Aanholt through for the award. Obviously Luka Milivojevic, the captain, fantastic performance in midfield in terms of breaking up play, winning loads of fouls, getting the ball back, maintaining possessions, and really the whole midfield done really well. But he in particular stood out for me, in terms of keeping James Maddison quiet, which was the main crucial thing before the game. He'd done that superbly well. But for me, it's just the way he started the game. The fact that from the off, he had that energy, he had that intent, and you can just see that he was up for the game more so than other players in the team. And that's why I put him forward for the award. And in terms of Wilfried Zaha, as always, a sheer attacking threat to the opposition. The fact that he had, in that first half in particular, where there were limited chances for both teams, the fact that he was always looking very lively, always looking to get on the end of the ball, always looking to obviously create chances, always looking to carry the ball. So the fact that he was always posing a threat to the extent that actually Leicester had to just keep chipping him and keep fouling him to obviously stop him, just goes to show how good his attacking performance was. But in terms of me, I think there is only one clear winner here, and that's just because of that mindset and just how quickly he started the game and how he just maintained that level of performance throughout the whole game, and that is Luka Milivojevic. So congratulations, Luka. You don't get a trophy or certificate, but you do get my sincere congratulations on what was yet another solid performance from you. And like I've said there, I've given it to him as opposed to the likes of Tompkins, Van Aanholt and Zaha, and certainly other players in the team. And it's just because the way he came out from that first whistle, just looked determined, was playing determined, and was just doing his all for the team throughout the rest of the game, is why I've put him forward for this week's Man of the Match award. Obviously, if you do disagree or you think I've missed someone out, of course, feel free to comment that below. And of course, do comment below with your overall Man of the Match for the game against Leicester. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my Man of the Match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson, Joe Ward and Patrick Van Aanholt after the game.
What do you think the difference was between the two sides today? I don't think there was much in it, to be honest with you. I think there wasn't really any part of the game where they put us under sustained pressure. I think we had some good spells and some good chances, and I think when it's 1-0, you've always fancied yourself to get back in the game, and we were unlucky not to do that. But it was also a bitter pill to swallow when they scored the second.
You've been so good at corners up until the last two games. Can you put your finger on why in the past two games the teams have been able to score?
Listen, I think when you're in the Premier League, sometimes you've got to hold your hands up, and delivery was good, or this or that. It was a good bit of movement. We pride ourselves on making sure that we prepare and look at our set plays and make sure that we try and do everything we can to kind of shut up shop. And unfortunately, today, they've found themselves in the 6-yard box after a little flick, and it's obviously a bit of one to swallow.
It's been a sad weekend for all of us that work at the training ground. AD will be sorely missed, won't he?
Yeah, definitely. I just said there, he was a guy that went the extra mile for every individual at the club, staff, players, whatever he done it with a smile on his face, and we remember him for that, and he was a permanent feature at the club, and he'll remain that.
Patrick, commiserations. What do you feel your performance overall deserved today?
Yeah, it's hard to stay here with the loss, I think we did well. We defended well as a team, and but I don't think we created that much. We could have scored, but we conceded from a corner, and then we conceded slowly after that as well.
You had defended very well up until their first goal. Was it a particularly bad goal to concede from your perspective?
We conceded 2 last week from the corner as well, so we knew it was going to be tough with the corners. But we trained all well on it, and unfortunately, we went in the back of the net.
As a defender, you always try and get something on the ball when a set piece comes over like that. Do you feel your own connection almost helped Leicester today?
I think I had a little flick on it, and if I didn't head it, I think Jack would head it away. But I haven't checked it back yet. But like I said, nothing more I can do about it.
It was a tight game throughout. At 1-0 down, how did you see a way back?
When we were 1-0 down, we said we still have time to get back in the game. Unless we just get back together and do what we always do and work hard. But unfortunately, they scored a 2-0.
How big a concern is conceding from set pieces? You mentioned the Arsenal goals as well last week.
But up until last week, we didn't concede that much from set pieces, and now we conceded 3 in two games. So something we have to work on and move on from it.
It's Chelsea up next, isn't it? These big games come thick and fast. You're a resilient set of players. Do you shrug off something like this easily and move on?
I'm normally 24 hours in the head and then move on to the next game. So I'm 24 hours and then focus on Chelsea.
Roy, it was a tight game, really. 2-0 probably it doesn't really reflect that.
Yeah, I thought it was a tight game. I thought that we defended very well against them. We know how dangerous they can be and how skillful they are in the middle of the park. But I thought we dealt with that pretty well, and we weren't, biting our nails on the touchline and fearing every time they attacked they were going to score a goal. And even after the 1-0, which was an unfortunate deflection which deranged our defensive setup, and they went 1-0 ahead, even after that I never thought we were actually out of the game until such time, of course, as we didn't throw caution to the wind, but we tried to play 4-4-2. We pushed Wilf up front and brought Christian Benteke on, which only left us with the 4 midfield players, and then I thought they had a bit more possession of the ball in that area. But I still think it was a gamble worth taking, but it did cost us a second goal, and that came so close to the end of the game that we weren't able to respond to that.
You had such a good start to the season. You've been very, very tough to beat, but at the other end you probably haven't scored as many goals as you would like.
No, and that was the case. It's been the case for the last 2 years. So, nothing's changed in that respect. We know it. The lads are doing their best, but we aren't perhaps as blessed as some teams with those, plethora really of goal scorers who can make chances and take chances out of nothing. We have to work very, very hard for our chances. And at the moment, with the players that we have to work with, I don't think scoring lots of goals is necessarily going to be something that we're going to be able to boast that we've done too often.
Obviously, some lovely touches from Wilf today. It was a glorious ball in the first half, actually. But he can be devastating. He looks a little short of that just at the moment. Would you agree?
No, he's been very good, but I mean, you're just asking me to comment on individual performances. In every game, you know, players play up to their standard, above their standard, maybe below their standard. That's the way it is, you know. You've got 11 players on the field. You know what they can do, you know what you hope from them. But there's always going to be variations in the standard of play they can produce. Wilf at the Arsenal last week was really excellent. Today, I'm sure he'll say I could have done even more than I did, but he certainly wasn't bad in any shape or form, and you just have to accept that people are trying their best, but it doesn't always go for them.
I just want to ask about Kouyaté, because obviously it was quite a nasty aerial collision. You took him off not long after that. Were the two related?
Partly. I mean, obviously we wanted to put someone on, like we put Max Mayer on. Of course, he's a much more creative player than Cech. Cech had done a fantastic job for us, I thought, but we'd gone the goal to nil down. We needed to find maybe a bit more creativity, we thought, in the midfield, so we needed to make a change, and that was at Cech's expense. But of course, we were also affected by seeing him take that nasty head injury, so we thought it was the wisest thing to do for him, and also tactically it might be something which would get us back into the game.
But he's feeling okay.
He's
all right?
okay, thanks.
Brilliant.
He's
All
fine.
right. Thank you very much.
Nice to
Appreciate it. Thank you. Much appreciated.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson, Joe Ward and Patrick Villano had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against Leicester City. But make sure to come back next week for my post-match review of the game against Chelsea. So thanks for listening, and remember to up the Palace.